Welcome to Transforming Trauma Podcast, a complex trauma podcast through the NARM Training Institute. My name is Sarah Bueno, and I am a psychotherapist here in Chicago and currently a NARM student. And I am so excited to share this podcast with you all. Transforming Trauma is presented by the NARM Training Institute. The Institute offers NARM practitioner trainings for mental health professionals who are looking for advanced training in complex post-traumatic stress disorder. The NeuroAffective Relational Model is a cutting-edge, innovative approach for resolving CPTSD, addressing attachment, developmental, relational, and intergenerational trauma. Today's guest is a dear friend of mine who is also a therapist in Chicago, Dr. Bianka Hardin. She is a somatic experiencing practitioner, a NARM therapist, licensed clinical psychologist, professor at the Chicago School of Professional Psychology, and the owner of Centered Therapy Chicago, LLC. Bianka has been a trauma therapist for over 20 years and teaches graduate trauma courses and is a training assistant for NARM and Essie. Bianka founded CTC in 2014 with the mission to help children, adolescents, and adults improve their mental health and quality of life. She provides therapy, supervision, and consultation services and presents in the community on issues related to parenting, child abuse prevention, self-care, mindfulness, trauma-informed care, trauma stewardship, and cultural issues. So I hope you enjoy listening to this episode as much as I enjoyed this conversation with Bianka Hardin. Hi, Bianka. Welcome to Transforming Trauma. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm good. It's funny to ask that question since we've been hanging out for several hours now. I know exactly how you are. You're great.
Yeah, I'm good.
And I guess I should give you your agency and let you tell me how you are.
I'm doing really great. Thanks for asking.
Yeah. So we're really excited to be launching this podcast for the NARM Training Institute. And I'm really, really happy that you are one of our first guests. And I talked about you on the intro episode, actually. So no pressure. No pressure.
Well, I am honored to be here. And I was really glad that I was asked to be a part of this. I think this is really meaningful and important. So thank you so much for having me today. Yeah.
Yay.
Yeah.
Want to introduce yourself a little bit more? Talk about the specifics of what you do?
Sure. My name is Bianka Hardin. I'm a licensed clinical psychologist, and I'm the owner of Centered Therapy Chicago. I've been doing trauma therapy for over 20 years, and I came across body-oriented psychotherapy a number of years ago, and it really changed me, and it changed the work that I do. And I got involved with the NARM community about 3 years ago, and it's been really wonderful. So I am a training assistant for NARM. I do introductory workshops. I also am a training assistant for somatic experiencing, and I am a professor. So I'm also a mom and a wife and a friend.
A very good friend at that.
Thank you. And a great human being. And I really have a heart for transforming trauma and social justice and just really sharing the power of healing through the work that I do. So that's me in a nutshell. Yeah.
In a nutshell.
Yeah.
And that's a good segue into the first question of sharing a bit deeper about your work in the field of complex trauma. You said you were personally drawn to it. It's helped you kind of shift some things. So what led you to it personally, and tell us more about your work?
Well, I moved to Chicago in 1995, and in my doctoral training, we needed to do a few different practicum trainings. And so the first practicum training I had was at the Margie Kovler Center for Survivors of Torture in the Bosnian Mental Health Center. And that was where I learned how to do regular therapy, was with people. There was a mental health interpreter. There was me. People were speaking their native language, and I was figuring out how to be a therapist. And
talk about pressure.
Wow. Yeah, I like to jump in the deep end of things. And so what was really impactful for me about that work was just the stance that my supervisor and the agency took about our humanity and a human rights orientation to the work, and just really being a human first. And it wasn't about technically what to do in terms of techniques or what to say, but how do you show up as fully human and really see people as being resilient and strong, and that, something may happen to people, and how do they move through that, and how do we appreciate clients from a strength-based perspective. And so I think me starting off as a therapist doing that work, it was an honor to learn that way and to also learn how therapists can be impacted by the work and that we need to do our own work to help protect ourselves from the sometimes negative impact of working with trauma. And so it was really cool because they had body workers there. And so if you were a therapist, they were students in training and you were able to get massages. And they also provided body work to the clients as well because the students at the massage school were getting it. And so I kind of learned this valuable lesson of like, how do I take care of myself while taking care of others? That's just how I got into the trauma work. And I also learned that there was so much happening in the world that I had no idea was going on. And it kind of felt like I was in a little American bubble and not really understanding trauma was happening all around the world. So it really kind of planted some seeds that are still coming to fruition today. And then after that, I read Judith Herman, Trauma and Recovery, and learned about relational therapy, feminist therapy, and really practiced in that way for many years. And another thing that I did to take care of myself was started doing education to the community about what trauma is and the impact of trauma on witnessing trauma on young children. And so that outreach and social justice element of the work really balanced out being a trauma therapist. And so that was really important for me in terms of thinking about my role in things and what can I do to make societal change.
I'm curious because as therapists who are getting trained in this, when we say trauma, I think we have a collective shared understanding of what that is. But I'm curious what those trauma trainings looked like for the general public. What were you talking about? What were you highlighting? What were you essentially trying to help people understand about trauma that you saw they didn't know?
I think there's a lot of misinformation about trauma. And so, for example, I worked with this coalition called the Safe from the Start Coalition through the Illinois Violence Prevention Authority. And there were myths about, like, say a child is under the age of 5 and they witness domestic violence or they are the victim of abuse. There was this mentality of like, let's not talk about it because they're not going to remember it anyway.
Right.
And so there was this leaning towards silence and not discussing, when in fact we know that children do remember these things. They may not remember them in the same way that they would have if it would have happened at an older age, but there's this way that the body remembers, right? Our nervous system remembers. The family system remembers, and then keeping these secrets within the family is quite damaging. So the trainings looked like we would go to daycare centers or work with judges or first responders, and we would educate them on the definition of trauma, the impacts of trauma on the body, mind, and spirit, and, you know, how to get help, like the Children's Advocacy Center. You know, is there an agency or is there a website, and what to do? So the importance of maybe getting support for the parents, getting support for the child, what therapy can look like, how therapy can be helpful for someone who's experienced a difficult event such as child abuse, witnessing domestic violence, emotional abuse and neglect, community violence. You know, imagine living in a community where it's not safe to go out to the playground, or you've seen people be physically harmed. Even though you may not have been physically harmed, the act of witnessing another person being harmed is psychologically and emotionally damaging. And so there really wasn't a lot of information out there like there is now about that. And I believe the more we can educate ourselves about what trauma is, the impact, a normal impact. It's a way that like we can experience event, and for us to be impacted is normal. It's not normal, right? The normal impact of being abused or victimized in some way, it takes the stigma out of it, and then it also provides some hope that there are ways that we can help children and adults work through these traumas, whether it be in a group, individual therapy, couples, family, even creativity, creative outlets, you know, like making artwork, making music, poetry, rapping. You know, there are so many ways that we can work through. And being in community is also quite healing, the relational aspect of working through trauma. So that's kind of what some of the education looked like.
Could you define for us the way that you define complex trauma?
Yeah, so there are ways that we think about trauma as like a singular event, potentially, like an act of violence, being in a car accident, living through a hurricane. Those singular events are more big T or shock trauma. But what's more common is this little t trauma or complex trauma, where these are smaller events that happen over the course of time. So if it's before the age of 18, we would call it developmental trauma, but this could be things like living in a home where a parent has significant mental health issues or substance abuse issues, and they're just not there to meet the emotional needs of the child or to see the child. And so a child may experience this daily or monthly over time. And so it's more subtle but quite insidious in that it impacts the way we view ourselves, our identity, and how we relate to others. And so complex trauma could be that there are a mix of big T traumas and little t. So it could be, a child encountering physical abuse over the course of their life, right? Or it could be more subtle, that the caregivers simply aren't emotionally present for the child and they may have their own issues. And this isn't to blame caregivers for not being there, because these things happen. But there's more of a chronicity of it versus a singular event trauma.
And I have found that the more I start educating clients on what developmental trauma is, for my clients who are parents, the first reaction, instead of thinking of their own stuff, they think about what they've done to their children.
Yeah.
And then that creates this whole, self-hatred cycle for them.
Yeah.
I'm curious how you create space with clients if they have that reaction. Have you seen that happen too?
I can just speak to my own experience of that. I mean,
bring it.
My son is 13 years old, and after he was born, so he was born in August, and then by Halloween, my dad had serious health events and he went into hospice and he died at Thanksgiving. So my son was 4 months old. And so just imagine, like, already, like, I had a baby. I'd never had one before. I didn't know what I was doing. I was clueless. And I was so competent in my life professionally.
Right.
And then I felt incompetent as a parent. And I had postpartum anxiety. So it was really stressful. And then I watched my father die slowly. He had had cancer and he was in remission, and then his cancer came back, and we dropped everything and we went to Ohio to be in the hospice with my father and my mother, and essentially watched my father die. And he wasn't the same man that he was before, in terms of like, he wasn't mentally present for the last 6 weeks or something like that. So that was really challenging. And then I was mourning the loss of my father. So I was doing my best, and I felt like having this beautiful little boy was like the saving grace in light of this significant loss, because my dad was my person. And I just wasn't the same person for at least 2 years after my father died. I mean, it's like I couldn't handle things the way I did before. It was a really difficult loss. So I did my best as a parent. And then I go to NARM and I learn about like the importance of like in utero in the first 12 months. If they don't get this, oh my gosh. And so I have to be honest to say that I was reflecting on my own presence as a parent for that early time in my child's life. And I thought, that's really unfortunate that I wasn't there for him the way that I could be. But the thing is,
the way that you wanted to be.
The way I wanted to be, but I showed up. And I did my best in light of this loss that was no one's fault, and had some compassion for myself. So I think it makes sense to worry about all the ways we can mess up our children, especially if you're a therapist. I think you might even think about that a little bit more.
I imagine.
I was balancing that with also like life happens and difficult things happen that are out of our control. And then I really believe parents are doing their best. And so I think me holding that while also hearing the ways parents beat themselves up, I can understand how I showed myself compassion. And then I can hold that when I'm talking with them. And they may not have it for themselves, but I can feel that's there and understand the ways they're relating to themselves. And part of their work may be that they want to work on how they view themselves as a parent. I need to, in NARM, we say, what is it that you want for yourself? And we ask them to what we call a contract. And so as I'm working with parents, I'm also mindful of not putting my agenda onto them. I really want to be present with what it is that they're wanting to work on. And so if it is around their relationship to themselves as parents, then we work on that.
And it's so funny that you say that. We went out to brunch, guys. We had a great brunch. It was amazing. And at brunch, I was sharing some stuff with a couple really tough cases that I have. And I credit NARM with giving me the ability to reflect in a more nuanced way how I've inserted my agenda in therapy. And a lot of it is my own developmental trauma of not being validated as a child led to that's like all I want now. And so not being a parent, I wouldn't be able to relate to someone on that level, but what I want to do is like validate how difficult that is.
Yeah.
And you're right, that might not be the client's agenda.
Yeah. I mean, with NARM, it's been really transformative. The listeners may not know this, but if you're training as a NARM therapist, you need to do your own NARM sessions, your own experientials. And it's a way of learning from the inside out. And I was actually talking to one of the trainers at my gym this morning, and I was telling him about NARM because that's what I do. I talk about NARM at the gym, and I was telling him...
We are walking little commercials. I love it.
I was telling him I'm getting to do this podcast today and how excited I am. And I had said one thing that makes NARM special and unique is that anyone who really wants to do NARM and become a NARM certified therapist or practitioner, they need to do their own experiential sessions. And he was like, oh, really? And I said, yeah, but I mean, what would you think? You're a personal trainer. Would you really trust someone as a personal trainer who wasn't working out? It's the same thing.
Yeah, that's a really great analogy.
Yeah. I mean, would you go to a personal trainer who doesn't work out and doesn't eat well? I mean, it's just not going to work. So in NARM, we believe in the importance of understanding our own healing journey, our own struggles, and holding it with humility. And I think that's really important, is that we're doing our own work. And so like often before going through the NARM journey, I might have an agenda for a client and put that onto them. But when I experienced it in the client seat, when the therapist said, what is it that you want for yourself? What I learned was that I had no idea what I wanted for myself. It blew my mind because I'm so accomplished and driven and a business owner. And that like when I'm in the client seat, that question was hard for me to understand. And then how did I relate to myself in that not knowing? I think it's because, I didn't have the experience of someone really querying into how things were for me and nurturing me early on in that way emotionally. My physical needs were definitely taken care of, but emotionally, not so much.
I think that there are lots of trainings that ask the therapist to do their own work. I'm a therapist who I get trained in a modality because I want it to fix me. That was always my number one agenda, but I have found that that's not how a lot of people think. So I've been in situations where I've been called to do that work on myself before, but there's something so much deeper about the NARM process and doing it that is unraveling really the foundation of, we talk about survival styles as having come out of our developmental trauma and the way that we use what in the field we would call potentially maladaptive behaviors, and we kind of flip that and call them survival styles in NARM that's based on the trauma. And there's something about the unwinding of that I have experienced so many different types of therapy, but nothing as deep as this. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I would definitely agree with it. I've done traditional therapy before for many years, and it was very helpful. And then I've done somatic experiencing therapy, which is a bottom-up, meaning body-oriented approach to processing trauma. And both of those were quite helpful. I think that what I can do is I can talk and talk and talk and talk and do more frontal work, but nothing's changing somatically for me, and even the deep way I see myself may not have changed that much. But with NARM, it's utilizing the frontal lobe, the top down and the bottom up. And so you've got this way that you're working at your whole experience, which is really rare. I'm sure there are other models that do it, of course, but I haven't experienced those. I can only speak to my experience. I haven't either, yeah. I can only speak to my experience with NARM, but there are ways that I felt such vulnerability as a recipient of NARM and allowed myself to have that experience. I also had this experience of having emotion and not understanding how to put words to the emotional experience I was having. Yes. And so if I was like, go into my frontal lobe and like put a word on that, it's going to take me out of the experience. So it's this way of like the therapist just being with you wherever you're at, whether you are able to differentiate your emotions or not. But like, it's really increased my capacity to be with really big emotional experiences where I think before I would get afraid and I would close it down and then I would go up to my frontal lobe and try to figure it out just up there by myself, you know, but this, there's this relational piece of NARM where the therapist is with you in it, supporting you, and doesn't have an agenda, and they're not pushing you one way or another. They're just with you. And I think for me, that holding just felt so nurturing for me and my whole being and allowed me to kind of grow up emotionally, like in the room, you know?
That's a beautiful way to put it.
Yeah. And so I just feel more calm and thoughtful and less reactive. I just feel lighter. And I had a client say something really interesting. She said, through this work, I feel like I've woken up to my own life. You know, so like there's this way we move through life and we're just doing life. But now I feel like I'm a relational participant in life and I'm not just doing life, I'm in life.
That's beautiful. So what led specifically to NARM? How did you get from your trauma work to Essie to NARM?
Yeah, so back to the previous story, I was doing relational feminist psychotherapy with clients. I'm a huge fan of Judith Herman. I think she's amazing. So I'm doing the work and I'm doing what I felt was like everything that Judith told me to do, like as if she's my friend, you know, but like I was like doing it.
Judith said,
I'm working the 3 stages of recovery and doing that pretty relationally, authentically, and through a feminist lens. And it just felt like we could go to a certain point and then that was it, you know?
Yes.
A good friend of mine, Dr. Shar Pierce, who I like to tease and say she stalked me for many years, saying, you really need to do somatic experiencing. It's life-changing. You would love it. And so I decided to sign up for the training. I had no idea what I was getting into because I don't read ahead. I just kind of like trusted her and I was like, this sounds cool. And then I went and I was like, oh, wait, this is 3 years. But of course, like once I fall in love with something, I'm like in it to win it. So I'm like, of course I'm doing it. I'm doing all the sessions. And it was really wonderful. That's a wonderful community to kind of understand how trauma is stored in the body, not in the event. Right. And it kind of like blew my mind because that's not anything I had really learned before. And this is before The Body Keeps the Score or maybe around that time. Like people weren't talking about that. So it was really mind-blowing for me to just think about that. And then talk about like parents feeling bad for the ways they harm their child. I was thinking like, how could I have been practicing psychotherapy and not understand the impact of the body? And like, if only, you know, and I think people have this with NARM as well. But, you know, we're just doing our best with the tools that we have. And so it was really transformative to be in the Essie community, to do that work for myself and for my clients. And through that, I got to know Brad Kammer, and he is on the Essie faculty. And he would do these day-long trainings before the Essie training came along. So I would go to those, and he did stuff on developmental trauma. And this is before it was called, I don't know if it was called NARM or not, but that wasn't in my awareness. It wasn't a thing yet. Yeah, it wasn't in my awareness. So I would attend these and I'd be like, oh, this is really cool. I would like it. And then he did a day-long NARM introduction that I attended. And I felt like this intuitively makes sense to me because at my roots, I'm a relational psychodynamic feminist, like an RCT, relational cultural theory, trauma therapist, right? And then I started doing SE. And so I was kind of like, how do I do this and use the wisdom of the body? And so I was kind of doing some things intuitively. So I decided to sign up for NARM, and I told myself, like, Bianca, if you're already doing this, girl, you just go to one. You don't need to go to everything.
Right.
Like, what if you're already doing this? Like,
Right.
So,
yeah, I think that too. I'm sure I'm already doing. I'm sure of it. It's just
I was
intuitive.
so confident that I was combining Essie and psychodynamic, But I enthusiastically went with that.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, I went to the first module, and it just blew my mind about how comprehensive it was. Like, yes, I was doing some things intuitively, but I didn't have a framework for understanding it and organizing it. Right. And this organization, even like what we call pillar 1, which is contracting, which is simply understanding what the client wants, like what's their heart's desire, what would they like to focus on, and how that organizes all the work that you do, because it's in alignment with what the client really wants, not what the therapist thinks the client should want. And that's how a lot of therapists practice is. They put their agenda on the client and they think this is what's best for them, which is kind of parentifying or making a lot of assumptions.
And to be fair, that's the way we're trained.
Yeah.
Because if we're trained to expect that we're supposed to move someone towards health, of course, we're going to say, well, XYZ is healthy, so I have to get you there.
Right. And all of that is informed by assumptions and what society says and all of that. But with this, you really get to the root of what the client wants for themselves, and that informs the work. And it's not easy work, even figuring out maybe what you want. And it wasn't for me, but yet it quite informs the work. So the whole framework in NARM that is 4 pillars that guide us, strength-based. There's a lot of humility in the work, and there's a central focus on the relationship and the relational component of healing, and that healing happens in relationship. And there's also this focus on the therapist and their own, what we call countertransference, which means their own reactions and how they show up and how that informs the work. And it's my belief that so many therapists aren't thinking about that at all. They're kind of acting out their own agenda and their own issues in the therapy room, not because they want to do anything damaging. It's just because they're not examining that important component. That's not incorporated into a lot of training, but since I was trained psychodynamically, it was always a foundational component of being a good therapist for myself. So anyway, I went to module 1, and then I was in it to win it. I was like, okay, sign me up, and can I assist? And yes, this is great. So it's really helped me as a person, and I have really worked on my own personal vulnerability and my ability to authentically show up, which has been really amazing, because I moved around a lot as a kid, moving every 1 to 3 years. I changed schools midway through. I lived in different countries. I lived in the States, different areas. And like, when you do that, if you don't make connections and make friends, you're on an island and you suffer, right? So I'm really good at like knowing what to say and what to expect and looking around, but like, how often do I actually show up as my authentic self? And is that safe?
Right.
And so it was my personal intention for myself to work on my vulnerability so that it can help my own relationship within my family, with my friendships, with me clinically, with me as a boss, all of that. And I think NARM really helped me through all of these protective strategies I had that were getting in the way of me showing up the way I authentically wanted to show up. So I found something that has been personally transformative. And whenever I do that, like, I want to tell everyone about it. I mean,
yes.
My experience with NARM is that I've seen it personally, and in the training, I've seen my friends and peers go through it and really transform how they're showing up in the world. It's just really life-changing. And so I'm happy and honored to be doing this podcast to share with other people about the potential for healing and change in your own life. I think it would be great to find a qualified NARM therapist and try it out.
I love how you've really woven in your personal experience with it, because I think that that's the thing that attracted me to NARM is just seeing the transformation in you. And I was like, I want that. I'll take it.
Yeah.
And when we change as therapists, it changes the way that we do therapy.
It does. Just the way I'm showing up as a human, like as a neighbor, as a therapist, as a friend, as a mom, as a wife. I mean, has really changed as a result of the work that I'm doing. And I just feel so much more alive and vibrant and not weighed down by a lot of the self-criticism. And I think so many of us go through life just beating ourselves up and telling us that we're not worthy or good enough, or we're just getting in our own way of what we really want. And for me, I can't speak for other people, is like authentic connection. I want to have fun, I want to be connected. I want to enjoy life. I want to make a difference, and just getting in my own way of efforting and beating myself up and not feeling good enough. And that's no fun.
No, it's not fun. I can tell you from personal experience, not fun.
Yeah. So there is another way to experience life if you would like to try it out, and make a choice. And it's not easy, but it's not easy living the other way either.
Yeah, there was a quote on Instagram or Facebook or whatever that was, will you choose the pain of repeating the same things over and over again, or will you choose the pain of transformation? Because they're both painful, but it's a different type of pain that you're signing up for.
Exactly. The vulnerability and, in my own healing journey with NARM, there were times I just felt like really raw and vulnerable, like
I know nothing about that. That doesn't resonate at all. I've been completely normal this whole training process.
I mean, it wasn't sunshine and strength. It was kind of like moving through and holding pain and really kind of having this emotional hangover for a bit. But then there's something on the other side of that, right? But I can't get to the other side if I don't move through it. We know there's not really that many shortcuts in life. Do you know what I mean? Like when I look on Facebook and they're like, drink this tea and you'll lose 20 pounds. It's not true. It's not going to happen. Do you know what I mean? But like we want that. We want to skip over the hard work and just get to the good stuff. But the thing is, you can't get to the good stuff without working through what comes before it or moving through that. You can't have joy if you're not able to tolerate and experience your own pain.
Very well said.
Yeah.
Well, let's shift the focus back to the clinical work that you do, because I think it's important to talk about, what that looks like. And I'm curious if you have any stories about your work with clients, either the struggle part of it or the inspiring part of the transformation when you've been working with a client with complex trauma.
Well, I always feel like it's an honor to work with people through their challenges or their complex trauma. And not all clients will identify themselves as complex trauma survivors. They may not have that label.
Most of them won't.
Most of them won't, right?
Hopefully they will after this podcast is circulated enough.
Yeah. But I've seen people really grab onto this NARM model, and I'm pretty transparent in my work. So I utilize what we like to call psychoeducation, which is informing clients about what we're doing and why. And when I'm utilizing NARM, I like to tell clients about NARM, reference the book, invite them to read it. And some people really enjoy that. They really like understanding what we're doing and why. And they even want to integrate the terminology of NARM into it. It's been really nice educating clients on what we like to call a contraction and an expansion. So like, say someone's working on their intention, and say their intention is to be more compassionate for themselves or something like that. And so in NARM, we also use something called agency. So we're noticing when someone's doing something they want to be doing, or they're doing something that's getting in the way of what they want to be doing, right? So we may notice someone is potentially showing some self-compassion. And so there's this softness that you may see with someone, and perhaps they're only able to tolerate it for 3 seconds, right? And then they start criticizing themselves that their work isn't going fast enough, and why are they still in therapy? They've been in therapy for so long. And so then we would notice that it looks like they were able to demonstrate the intention that they wanted of self-compassion for 3 seconds, and then they started criticizing themselves for not doing it right or not doing therapy right. The expansion is the time when they're able to do that, right? They're more connected to themselves, they're having self-compassion, and then there's this contraction where maybe they start criticizing themselves. And so it's really fun for me when the clients and I have this common terminology, and then we're like, notice the expansion and then the contraction. And then we like maybe look at each other and we start laughing, and they're like, yeah, I was able to do it for 3 seconds, and there's this way that like we're on board together utilizing NARM with the terminology. They get it, and it's consensual. And that we're recognizing the struggle and how difficult it is, but yet they're able to do it. Right. And so it's been really great in terms of working with clients who are beginning to understand how difficult and complex their childhoods were. And they would always minimize it because they were minimized as children, right? Like, you don't have it that hard. There are people starving in Africa. No one's beating you. Like,
exactly.
And so in the work, we're able to kind of recognize the nuanced complexity of how difficult things were and how invalidated they felt, and how now as adults, they're invalidating themselves, as a way of keeping that early connection. And so it's been really nice seeing people's understanding of the nuanced complexity and having compassion for themselves, not only as children, but as currently as adults. And just really feeling like they're stepping into the life that they want to live. So that's been really refreshing. And hearing them reflect on how far they've come in their own healing journey. And they might like to credit me as the therapist, but I remind them, they're the ones doing the work, right? They're the ones who are showing up every week, taking time out of their schedule, using their resources, all of the ways that they are doing the work, and I'm accompanying them on that journey is really cool. So it's really enjoyable work. And I think the model has a way of releasing all the pressure I was putting on myself before about making something happen. Like, I can just sit with what is. And I've noticed that when we can sit with what is, there's a relief that happens in that. And that we're not pushing something that isn't ready to be pushed or doesn't want to be pushed. Or maybe, we're just being with. A lot of us haven't had that experience of someone just being with us as we are.
Well, and our culture doesn't support that.
The
capitalism is really all about doing more, succeeding, and being the best. And so there isn't space for just being with what is.
Yeah.
So it's a very different invitation.
It is. And it's refreshing for many people.
Well, the last question I have for you is there anything that you've learned in your work with complex trauma that's helped you specifically that you would like to share with other people besides everything?
Yeah.
It's such a big question, right?
One thing that really resonated with me, I'm a training assistant. So we just finished up a module in Florida, module 4. So we were done with our first Florida cohort of NARM Therapist. And one thing that really stuck with me that I feel like I would like to honor more, and I would love it if society honored this more too, is like, people have protective strategies that help them survive, and they're there for very good reasons. And what stuck with me is like the importance of holding and honoring those strategies, and not trying to eradicate them or saying they're bad. And in traditional therapy, we want to maybe get rid of defenses, or we want to like minimize defenses, or we call things resistance. But like, there's this way in NARM that we just honor what's showing up.
Right.
And what's showing up as a protective strategy is as important as what's showing up as something that wants to change the intention someone has for themselves. And that we hold them equally. And in that, there's freedom.
Yeah.
Right? Because if I'm a therapist who wants to get rid of this protective strategy, and I look at it and I work on it, well, guess what? It's just going to want to stick around and be there, but it's there for this really important reason. And so I think that honoring the whole person that shows up is really a gift. I feel like some emotion as I say that, because like, I think as I recognize that, I also then hold that for myself.
Yeah. And I was thinking that too, as you were talking, I still have that internal resistance to accepting those parts of myself because of the conditioning of you shouldn't be shaming yourself. You should be perfect, and all of that language that, as we are taught in the training, is just self-hatred.
Yeah. And I mean, I want to resist my own self-hatred, but yet in that resistance, there's that efforting. And what if I just noticed it was there, and that there's some good reason it was there. And that's not what I want for myself, but I also can't blow it up. Then you blow up a part of yourself. So I feel like a little bit lighter with myself and with my clients. And so as a therapist, I think that's really important, because I know we all learn this in school, is that it's not about you, it's about the client, right?
Right.
But many therapists forget about that, and they take things really personally, and they're having their own reactions, which is part of being human. But if we can hold it there as like a strategy, and that they needed that to survive, and I'm working on myself, I am going to be less reactive. I am going to be neutral and be able to hold those difficult things, which I think is a really big takeaway for me. Honoring the whole person.
Yeah. And you've really said it so beautifully. So how do you feel about your initial intention to share your appreciation for NARM and how transformative it is?
Well, I feel like I hit a home run.
Yeah, that's what I like to hear. I do too.
Yeah, thanks.
I do too.
Yeah.
Is there anything you'd like to share in closing?
I do believe that change is like throwing a pebble in a pond, and then there are these ripple effects, and that one person's healing journey not only impacts themselves, but their family and their community and their clients. And so I do hold hope for greater healing in society, and I think we really do need it. And I think that NARM is part of the answer to just creating healing in society. So, I'd like to thank everyone for their interest in tuning in, and thank you for being with me to talk about it.
So what do you think? Is Bianca something else or what? I dig her. I'm going to keep her as a friend. Thanks so much for joining us for today's episode. If you want to learn more about Bianca and the work that she does, you can check out the show notes or visit us at www.narmtraining.com/transformingtrauma. That's www.narmtraining.com/transformingtrauma. The Transforming Trauma podcast is brought to you by the NARM Training Institute. NARM practitioner trainings for mental health professionals are offered across North America and internationally. We really, really want to hear from listeners. So if you're interested in connecting with us, of course you can go to the website, but you can also find us on social media. And one of the most robust places to find us is on Facebook. You can connect with us there at NARM Training. And we really look forward to hearing from you and everything you want to know about complex trauma. Thanks as always to Andrea Klunder and the Creative Imposter Studios for producing and editing, and to Tori Essex for our album art. We really look forward to building community and connection with you and changing the world by transforming trauma.